Alright, so going to talk about the Columbian Exchange from topic 4.3 here. Our learning objective is to explain the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effects on the Eastern and Western Hemispheres. Structured this lecture so that we'll cover the historical development with lots of evidence about the new connections between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres that resulted from animals, new plants, and diseases known as the Columbian Exchange. Now, this term was created by Al Crosby, a historian at the University of Texas. He defined this as the contact between any two people geographically separated from one another results in an exchange of physical elements. So first off, we have the animals. Now here, not all animals that Europeans brought came directly from Europe. Some of these animals came from Africa and Asia with the Europeans transporting them. The only domesticated animals in Latin America before the Europeans arrived were the llama down there in South America, and then the turkeys were the only ones in the north. Now, the effects of these animals in this exchange, the introduction of cattle and horses provided new forms of transportation and mobility in warfare. These animals, the cows and horses, also provided hides and meats. As well, they completely changed the use of land. This significantly impacts the environment. The European livestock multiplied quickly, and the land was destroyed with their hooves in America. Now, another effect is fertilizer from animals becomes an important part of the agriculture system. We see a real big increase of agriculture with animals and plants in the Americas. And lastly, the beaver and other fur-bearing animals significantly influenced the exchange between Americans and Europeans. Fur trade is huge, especially for the further northern part of the Americas. All right, our next piece is the plants. The Europeans brought cash crops to the Americas and took new cash crops back. So we see on the left side here what went to the Americas from Europe. Like the animals, some came from Africa and Asia. These new crops flourished in the Americas. Cash crops were grown primarily on plantations with coerced labor and were exported mostly to Europe and the Middle East. This is where, we see that huge shift in the economy to a large-scale agriculture production. One of the adverse effects is that many indigenous plants in the Americas were crowded out by new crops and weeds. So the old world crops were stronger. They had more competitive in their original environment. And some were lost. Now, things that were taken to Europe, we see on the right-hand side. And the things that I bolded and underlined are some key ones that you want to remember. So let's look at some more of the effects of plants. So foods such as bananas and wheat diversified American diets. Then we have other crops like sugarcane and cotton were intended for cultivation through exploited labor. Because sugarcane was not originally in the Americas. The Europeans brought that over and then mass-produced this. American crops such as potatoes and maize had a big impact on the European agriculture. In fact, they benefited the Europeans nutritionally with that increased diversity of the American food crops. Then other foods like okra were brought by African slaves. Just like we have the synthesis of religions with our land empires. We have some synthesis going on with our oceanic transfers, especially with food and other culture things that we'll talk about later on. All right, let's take a look at the diseases, the old world microbes. So European diseases were particularly harsh. The most common diseases exchanged were smallpox, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, chickenpox, bubonic plague, scarlet fever, and influenza, which is your flu. These diseases were endemic in the Eastern Hemisphere. They were communicable by air and touch, whereas the pathway for these diseases was invisible to both Native Americans and Europeans. Now, part of the effects of these diseases goes into thinking and knowing about the rapid spread of these diseases. And at the time when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they had no theories about germs. Illness in Europe was considered to be a consequence for sinning. The Europeans' colonization of the Americas led to the unintentional transfer of disease vectors, including mosquitoes and rats. Native Americans were seen as heathen or non-Christian. Therefore, they were regarded as sinners and subjected to illness as a punishment. In most cases, Native Americans became sick even before they had direct contact with Europeans. The reason for this is your trade goods traveling from tribe to tribe through the middleman were often the vehicle for the spread of disease. You see, the Americans, came into the coastlands and those tribes, and you had contact with them, and those tribes are continue to do their trade inland, and you have, this spread of disease. It happens pretty quickly because business as usual, just get the foreigners coming over. There is no credible evidence that Europeans intentionally infected trade items in order to infect Native Americans. As you should know, most pathogens originate with animals or insects. So with the domesticated animals and plants more common in Europe, Europeans had a natural immunity to these diseases. With that greater diversity meant more ecological protection. However, the Americans didn't have access to all these domesticated animals, and that's why it had a devastating blow. Now, on the other hand, Europeans did bring back American diseases like syphilis. All right, lastly, the most major effect is of smallpox, the deadliest disease of the Europeans to the Americas. In central Mexico, the population decreased from 25 million in 1510 to less than 1 million in 1605. So less than 100 years, and lost 24 million people in Mexico. It's a huge city, huge area, not just cities. Then in Hispaniola, the island, the population decreased from 1 million in 1492 to 46,000 in 1512. In just 20 years, you have over half of the population gone. And in North America, 90% of Native Americans were gone within 100 years of the landing on Plymouth Rock. Huge population decreases. Now, what we did in class is we went over these 4 questions. I encourage you to go back through your notes, take a look at the answers to these questions. Number 1 should be right there in your notes about what products, notice the plural, were produced on large plantations by slave labor for the world market. We have tobacco that was greatly wanted in the Middle East. Cotton is a big plantation player, especially for the United States, as most of you know, and you'll learn a lot more about that particular production in a push. And then the big player, though, for WAP would be your sugarcane. Remember, again, sugar did not originate in Americas. The Europeans brought it over, saw the soil was perfect for sugarcane, and then it exploded. Number 2, what turning point best justifies the claim that the late 1400s marked the beginning of a new period in world history? Now, this whole topic is called the Columbian Exchange, but think bigger. What is the Columbian Exchange? But the Europeans westward exploring and discovery for new trade routes is that key turning point to this new period in world history. Number 3, if you are researching the effects of epidemic disease on the plantation levels of 17th century colonial Peru, what sources would be most useful? So with this question, we're historians in World History AP, so we need to think like historians. And if you want to know the effects of these diseases back in 17th century colonial Peru, first you need to think about what type of information do you need to know. Now, if we're looking at effects of the disease, and all the populations died, so we need some record about how people or when people died. In contrast, we also need to know when they were born. So kind of take a look at when, that difference in age and so forth. And think back into 17th century. In Peru, we have specifically, as the Europeans come over, which Europeans are coming to Peru? Are they the Portuguese? Are they the Spanish? French? English? 17th century, we have the Spanish. Which religion are our Spanish conquistadors? And they are Catholic. So what records might Catholics have that would show you births and deaths? Now, with Catholic Church, a lot of students in class mentioned, we can look at graves. Well, who controls those graves? The church, once again. So with Catholics, they have those different sacraments. And you have the sacrament that's pretty much at your birth, which is your baptism. We can look at those records and compare them to our funeral records. And then the last question, comparison, the classic thinking skill. Compare the spread of epidemic diseases in the Americas in the 16th century with the spread of epidemic diseases in Eurasia during the 14th century. So the first thing hopefully you think about is, of course, smallpox in the Americas in the 16th century compared to the bubonic plague in Eurasia of the 14th century. Think about things that are similar and different between the spread of these two epidemic diseases. Who's spreading them, where they're spreading, how they're spreading. To what extent is the damage and the effects of these diseases spreading. Most students think of similarities really easily, but also look at some of those key differences. And each of my classes came up with some nice, unique answers. And comparing is a key thing that we always need to think about. Always a good thing to do, especially after you do finish writing your learning objectives. Of course, this one is cause and effects. But also start comparing it to what else we already know. So, hope you enjoyed listening to Columbian Exchange again, or possibly if you were absent for the first time, and happy completing your learning objectives, and we'll see you next time.